Thank you, Edward. You see why we made him the Speaker of the House, don't you? Speaker of the Congress. Wonderful. You might find this as an interesting side note. Just before the meeting, Edward came up to me, he says, I'm on, right? I said, yeah, in a few minutes. He says, I haven't the foggiest idea what I'm going to say. And I thought to myself, sure, I've heard that before. His fog is like a bolt of lightning for most people. But the rest of it is I had to say back, I don't either. And that is true. I have not prepared this, but by golly, if I can't talk about Freedom Force, I can't talk about anything. So on the cuff, I'll try my best. Edward has covered some very important points about Freedom Force, so I don't need to go into all of the things that he's mentioned. But I chose the topic of power because power is a very interesting word, and it means different things to different people. And if you look it up in the dictionary, you've got all kinds of different meanings, you know, mathematical powers, the second power, third power, power of an engine, and all that sort of thing. But we're talking about the power to change the world, the power to change society and the rules under which people live. It's probably the most powerful power of them all. And I became first interested in that topic without knowing where it was going to take me in my life. But many years ago, in fact, in the 1960s, is when I caught fire onto what was really going on in the world. And I was very much in learning mode. I had no interest in these things before that. I was in the corporate world. I was thinking about trying to climb the corporate ladder. I'd been on a couple of the lower rungs, and I looked up and I thought, boy, that looks pretty good up there. So I was trying to do what I thought I had to do to be like everybody that was up at the top, which is why people are so regimented in the corporate world. You don't have to tell them what to do. You just show them who succeeds and who gets knocked off the ladder. And you figure you don't want to be the guy that got knocked off the ladder, so if you want to go to the top, you be like the guy that's up there, and nobody has to tell you what to do. You figure it out for yourself. Well, I was on that path, and I became interested in ideology. I saw a video, and it told me some things I didn't want to hear about the United Nations, which Edward said led me eventually to write a book about that very topic. But I was very much a proponent of the United Nations. Remember, this is 1961, 1962. And the UN was untouchable in those days, as it still is in minds of many people. But I thought that, from what I had learned in school, that the UN was our last best hope for peace. And we certainly didn't want the atomic war. We didn't want any war for that matter. We wanted everybody to live in peace and brotherhood and work out their problems around the discussion table. And we wanted to send vaccines to all the third world countries and save those poor people from diseases and so forth. And I went in for all of it. You know, it sounded wonderful. So when I heard this criticism of the United Nations, I thought, this doesn't sound right. And fortunately, one day I had some time. My main office in the corporation for which I was working was in downtown Los Angeles. I had some time over lunch. I had to meet somebody, and I had about 45 minutes waiting around. And fortunately, the main library in Los Angeles was just a couple of blocks away. I'd often walked by it. I tried to assiduously avoid libraries ever since I graduated from school. And because reading books I thought was a terrible waste of time. And, so I walked by the library all these years, or 2 years or 3 years before that. This day I decided to go into the library and see if I could learn something about the United Nations and confirm my conviction that it was wonderful. So I don't want to drag this on, but it's kind of what led me to where I am today. You might find that a little interesting. So I went up to the International Affairs Department, and I asked somebody, where are the books on the UN? And they said, down there. Well, there weren't too many, but maybe 12 or 13. I noticed, the first thing I noticed, they were all written by people who worked for the UN or who were academics who were part of the UN, association and things like that. And I was looking for something from someone who was a critic of the UN to see if I could confirm or at least find the source of some of the things I'd heard about it. And I couldn't find any. So I checked out a couple of the books and I read through them and I said, this is bunk. I don't know where that wisdom came from, but it was bunk. You could tell it was propaganda. It was all slanted. So that started me down the path, and it wasn't long after that I wandered down to Larchmont Street in Los Angeles, and there was a communist bookstore down there. It was called the People's Bookshop. So I went in. I thought, well, I want to see what these people look like. And they looked just like everybody else, except, there was sort of the hippie period, and there were a couple of hippie types in there, but there were some normal-looking people, and they looked at me very suspiciously. I'm all dressed in a suit and a narrow tie, the sideburns that you had to wear in those days. And they knew I was a corporate guy. And so anyway, they showed me around, and I expressed some interest, and I checked out some books. And it turned out for the next, 6 months or so, I probably read all of the major works that they had, and the works of Lenin and Khrushchev and Stalin and all of those, and Marx, of course. You have to start with that. And so I sort of became an aficionado. They invited me to attend some of their recruiting meetings. They thought that maybe they would like to have a young corporate executive type in the Communist Party. They didn't call it a recruiting meeting. They called it an informational meeting. And so I went to a couple of them, and they study groups. They call them that also. And I realized that having read the books, I knew more about Marxism and Leninism than those guys did. They had never read the books, but they'd heard the slogans, from each according to his ability, to those according to their need, and all that stuff, against racism and war and all these things. And I knew the origins of these things. So anyway, I got very much up to speed on Marxism and Leninism. Now, I make a distinction between that because many people think that Marxism and Leninism are, what is that, two different words for the same thing, and it's not so. Marxism is based on the writings of Karl Marx, of course, in Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto. And basically it's the ideological and somewhat economical base for socialism. And Marx made it very clear that communism was something that would come in the future after socialism would be successful. There was no communism in the world, according to Marx, and Lenin, by the way, in those days, because communism was the ultimate goal, and Marxism was socialism was a stepping stone to communism. So even though we called countries like Russia as communist countries, they weren't really. Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as we all know. And they considered the hardcore communists, and the ones that read the books, knew that that was not communism, it was socialism. And the one thing that fascinated me, and this is where I'm going with this topic of power, is Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was quite an authority on how to come to power. That was probably, if you had to say, the summary of Lenin's contribution to the Marxist-Leninist literature, it would be coming to power. And the key to that is that Marxists believe in the socialist ideology, and that's about it. They believe in the idea of socialism or communism, or what we'll soon identify as collectivism later on. So the Marxists are the theorists. They're the academics, the teachers, the debaters, and so forth. Now, Lenin came along and added something to it. Lenin is considered to be the founder of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party is a whole different animal from the group of academics who talk about Marxism. The party was an organization dedicated to the creation of Marxist political systems, to overthrow countries, to, in Lenin's words, come to power. And his philosophy, if you take all of those books, and he was a prolific writer, if you take all of his writings, all of his essays, and you had to boil them down to one thing, it would be, this is a manual on how to come to power. That's all of it. And I just give you, you've heard the slogan, you know, he said, promises are like pie crusts made to be broken, and so forth. He's a very quotable guy. And why are promises made to be broken? Well, because it brings you to power. You see, everything was coming to power. That was the theme. Even if you didn't see it written, it was between the lines of everything he wrote. He said, comrades, we're trying to come to power in some country which is very nationalistic, and they don't like communism. So what do? You go in there and say you're a communist and you want to overthrow their country? Of course not. Comrades, what you do is you go in and say you're against communism. You tell them you're for nationalism and for all of the old cultural values of the system. You become one of them, and they look at you as a leader. You get it, comrades? You become their leader. Once you get their leader, then you get into power. You see, everything is to come to power. Once you're in power, now you can reveal yourself, but it doesn't make any difference, because if they object, you kill them. You have the police power of the state. You have the armies. You have the media. You see, this is Leninism. And there was never a country in the world that was ever taken over by Marxism. All of those countries that we like to call communist countries were taken over by Marxist-Leninists. They put a slash usually between those two words. And when you see the phrase Marxist-Leninist, look at the word Leninist, and you know that you're dealing with a group of people who are coming to power. They're not just debating. They're not just talking about whether the poor should have a collective pool to draw from or all of that nonsense. They're talking about what lies, deceit, killing, cheating, stealing, whatever it takes to come to power. Those are the people you're talking about. Now, is this exclusive to the communists? No. Every political system in the world is based on that philosophy, but they don't organize it and explain it quite so brilliantly as Lenin did. You go to all of the tin horn dictatorships down and around the world, and you understand they operate on the same principle, but they never wrote about it. It just sort of comes of, instinctive. Lenin was all about coming to power. Now, having said that, I rejected that, of course. Lenin is a bad guy. He stood for collectivism. Everything he did resulted in the enslavement and the impoverishment of the people, even in spite of the slogans. I was against that. And so, like so many people, young people especially, I was young in those days, I thought, every time I stood up on my soapbox and spoke out on this topic, I said, power is bad. Look, Lenin wants to come to power. And then Lord Acton shows up with his quote, that beautiful quotable thing, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, And so I memorized that quote, and I would always quote it and I'd say, you see, for this reason, and this reason, we who stand for individualism, although I hadn't at that stage realized that's what I was either, Edward, I didn't know there was a name for it at that time. We who believe in individual rights and personal freedom, we can never come to power, because then we would be on the other side. And I used to preach that in my silly way. It felt good. It felt right. And I noticed that from 1960 to 1970, 1980, 1990, we were losing. All of the arguments, like the Marxist arguments, we had the freedom arguments, we were losing. Arguments were not enough. Losing. Every battle we went into, we were losing to the Marxist-Leninists or their counterparts in some other political subdivision or category. And then one morning, I remember it very clearly. The sun was just coming up. You know, look through the shades in the window, you can see there was a little bit of light coming through. And I had been tossing and turning, I guess, thinking about this all night. And I remember sitting up in the bed, and I didn't speak it out loudly, I don't think. I have to ask my wife about that someday. But I sat up and I said to myself, oh, we lose. And it dawned on me, it had been gnawing in the back of my brain all this time, and it finally solidified during that night in sleep. We lose because impotentes defendere libertatem non possunt. Those without power cannot defend freedom. It's as simple as that. Now, power is dangerous. Acton was right. Power corrupts. Absolutely. Yes, he was right. So the question is it possible, is it ever possible for a people who love freedom to seek power without having the power corrupt them or their descendants who assume that power afterwards? This is the question, I think, of mankind. It's the big question. Can we live as individual human beings, or must we be submerged in the beehive collective so that we can survive? There has never been an answer yet, because so far, well, the answer hasn't arrived. I hope maybe it has now. I believe that, yes, it is possible if you turn your mind to it. First, you have to understand what the problem is before you can solve the problem. And I don't think anyone has focused a lot of attention on what is the definition of the problem, which is, as Edward so well pointed out, this battle between individualism and collectivism. The idea that what is the center of society? Is it the individual or is it the collective, because that's for the greater good of the greater number? And I have tried to show in my writings, and if you're interested in how we get to this conclusion, come to freedomforceinternational.org and get to my boring essays on this, and you will lead, if you follow me all the way through, to the conclusion, I hope, that yes, the best interest of the group, in other words, the greater good of the greater number, can be achieved, but only by preserving individual rights. That is the greater good of the greater number. If you focus on the greater good of the greater number and ignore the individual, then you destroy both. You cannot achieve it any other way. The individual is supreme. Now, that doesn't mean the individual should have free rein to do anything the individual wants to do against his fellow man. That doesn't mean that the individual has a right to go out and cheat and steal and murder and all these things that we don't approve of. For excellent reasons, of course. It means we must determine what are the limits on the individual and be very clear on those limits so that we don't go beyond them, even if we have power. We have to first find out what are the limits of the individual's reign of superiority, and then we have to construct some kind of a social or political system with guardians of the principle who know exactly what that principle is, who devote a major portion of their lives, if not their whole lives, to enforcing that, not through guns and bayonets and laws, but through public information, influence, education, the kind of things that we're doing right here today. If people understand, now I don't say everybody, if people, how many people? If 1%, 2%, or 3% of the world understands these principles, they will be enforced if those 3% are movers and shakers. Sometimes people say to me, aren't you disappointed? Aren't you frustrated that, look, people aren't listening? My neighbor doesn't care. He just wants to cut his grass, that's all. I talked to him about this. No, he wants to go play golf, cut his grass, watch Dancing with the Stars or whatever it is. And I used to feel that way too. But now I'm enlightened. I realize that no, you don't have to have your neighbor. Let him cut his grass. These people never determine history. If you look backwards in history, you'll see that every major event that's ever happened has been led by a group of 2 or 3% of the population, no more. But they were a dedicated and mobilized force. They knew what they were about, they had a creed, they had a belief system, and they were willing to work for it, and they brought it to pass. The American Revolution, how many people were involved in that? About 3% were solidly patriots of the revolution, something like that. Most of them were in their homes thinking, see, which side is going to win, because that's the side I'm going to be on. Some of them left the country because they didn't even want to take a stand because they were afraid that they'd be on the losing side. And it was about 3%. Everywhere you look, in every major change in society, it was initiated by an amazingly small group of people who were dedicated to their cause, and they knew what their cause was. Now, we get to that as another topic. Everybody says, I'm for freedom, and you say, well, how do you define freedom? Being out of jail? They don't know what freedom is. What does it take to have freedom? So back to this issue, I want to touch on this issue. What are the limits on freedom for the individual? And we've come to the amazingly simple conclusion, and it was already written in the Constitution, or the preamble, or the Declaration of Independence, I should say, to the Constitution, the defense of life, liberty, and property. Those are the things that individuals have a right to use force to defend. If you attack my life, I'm entitled to kill you if I have to. I don't want to do that. But if you're trying to kill me, no one, or very few people, would criticize the fact that I use lethal force to defend my own life or my own property. If you're trying to steal something of mine, no, you can't do that. That's instinctive. We have this instinct for property. It's a part of us. You can say it's good or bad. It's part of us, and I think it's good because it leads to all kinds of positive things that we can talk about at some other event, but we have the instinct to defend our property and our freedom. Oh, Lord, do we have an instinct to defend our freedom? And we can use force to do so, but nothing else. I can't use force against my neighbor to make him close his shop on Sundays. But we have laws on the books in some places. Used to have more. I can't force my neighbor not to drink alcohol, although we tried that for a while and that didn't work. I can't force my neighbor to do anything using force except not to kill me, not to take my liberty, and not to take my property. That's where the limit is. Now, if we get that very clear, sometimes in libertarian circles they call it the defensive principle or the non-aggression principle. It's the same thing. It's a very solid principle, and you can stand it. Now, naturally, there's going to be some gray areas occasionally that, well, did you really have to do that? Was it excessive force? And all that sort of thing. That's what we have courts for. But the principle is clear. So, once we understand this is the basis of liberty, this is the basis of freedom, the freedom is to do anything you jolly well please as long as you don't threaten or take your neighbor's life, liberty, or property. Now you have a foundation for building a society which I think is the ideal society. Will not be perfect. Humans are not perfect, but it'll be the best possible considering human nature. Now, the Marxists and the Leninists say, well, that might be true, but that is why we are going to change human nature. We're going to change how you think. We're going to practice eugenics and change how you're born and what your incentives are and your instincts are. We're going to change all that. Well, that's not my topic either. As long as we live in the real world, in a world of freedom, in which nobody's meddling with our brains or with our genetic structure, then we can stand firm on what we call the creed of freedom. So that was the first thing that drove me to recognize that in order to fight this thing, is we must know what we believe in, not only what we're against. We must have a goal of our own, some kind of an achievement that we want to create. And people say, well, if you don't like this, what would you replace it with? Well, we better have an answer to that. And so Freedom Force has an answer, and it's contained in the Creed of Freedom. Now, back to this thing called power. How do we bring this Creed of Freedom and these ideals which it represents, how do we bring them into society? How do we make them the dominant moray of society? Well, you have to have power. I mean, that doesn't mean police power necessarily, although ultimately that's what it comes to. But the greatest power in society is the power of influence and good example. We have to be in leadership positions or within organizations that have influence over the thinking and the opinions of the people. We have to be in there, like our opponents, our collectivist opponents know very well how important it is to control the educational system and the major media. They understand how important it is to recruit thought leaders. They go to people who are leaders of organizations like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and church organizations, social clubs. They deliberately recruit those people, or they bring their own people who have been trained and put them in and say, now I want you to move up and I want you to become president of your local Kiwanis club, or whatever it is, your labor union. That's a favorite target, of course. And so they go in there with that goal in mind, and I've seen some of their training manuals. This is real, folks. While we're out there playing our golf games and enjoying life, and as Edward said, we're having a good time, our opponents, our collectivist opponents, have been organizing, planning. In other words, they have become, whether they know it or not, Marxist-Leninists. They're coming to power. And we're wondering, what happened to us? This is what happened to us. We were asleep while they were waging war against us. We didn't even know we were in a war. That's why we didn't win it. Yes, we were and we are, and we're going to continue to be in this ideological war between collectivism and individualism, probably for the rest of our lives. It'll never go away. So the question is now, what are you going to do about it? I hope you'll make the same decision I did, and that is I want to fight back. I'm not going to stand around and just say, isn't this terrible? No, I'm going to stand back, stand forth and do whatever I can to oppose and defeat collectivism, especially that which is empowered in the state. And we need, in order to accomplish that goal, we need others just like you. Everyone here in this room should be a member of Freedom Force International. I can't think of any reason. You will like the Creed of Freedom, and when I say you will, I don't mean in the German sense, you will like it. No, I don't know. No, that's not how we work. Jawohl. Any Germans watching this, that's not meant as a slur or anything. It's just kind of an American meme, No, you will like it because you're here because you have those instincts and those thoughts that you're in tune with it. I can guarantee you that. But I want you to read it. I want you to say, yeah, I believe in that. That's the only requirement we have in Freedom Force is just be on the right page. We all want to be fighting not only against tyranny, but somewhere down the line we'll be fighting for something to replace it. And we better be on the same page then. Otherwise, we'll be in the same trap that has captured most of history. People have fought off tyrannies one after the other at great cost in treasure and blood. And what happens when the tyranny is overthrown? They replace it with another one just like it. Or worse. We don't want to do that, which means we must know what we believe. So the first thing is read the creed, say, that's for me, and then, okay, what do we do now? This is the weakness everybody's told me. Is that, Edward, you've never asked people to join Freedom Force. And I said, well, can't they figure it out? No, yeah, they figured it out, but you got to show them what to do. Okay, I'm going to show you what to do. Well, I don't have my smartphone, a brand new smartphone. I don't know how to operate it, so it probably just as well I didn't bring it up here. But you take your smartphone and you turn it on, and you go to the internet somehow. I haven't figured that one out. Or if you're on your home computer, right? You go onto the internet, and the website is www.freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org. Okay, that gets you to the home page of Freedom Force. Look it over, go look at the Creed of Freedom, and check it out. Check out our leadership council, see these magnificent people we have on our council. Here in this group, you've already met them. And see who's in our Hall of Honor, check out our creed, think about it, and if you decide you're ready to join the team, then you'll go to the top left, let's see, you're looking at it backwards, that would be the top left corner would be over here, and it says join us. Now, that's it. Click on the button and follow the directions, and welcome to Freedom Force. Thank you very much.